My name is John Andrew Quinn, currently 69 years old, and this event happened to me a little over 5 years ago. It was early March of 2018. And I am a musician and composer by choice. And among other things, I do to make money, but that's my main focus in life. And not so much a performer these days, but composer, arranger, songwriter. And I guess, I don't know if any of this is particularly relevant. I grew up in New York City. I lived for 30 years in various parts of California, mostly Northern California. And then, so I think about 2011 or so, I moved to Vermont through a relationship and ended up staying in Vermont. My mom was living on Long Island in New York, and she died in 2016, which is somewhat relevant. She died in April of 2016. And so anyway, I was living in a really rural area of Vermont, about 30 miles outside of Burlington in the mountains. And so it was early March, had a nice snowstorm going. I loved to cross-country ski. I'd gotten into that in my later years. Around 2010 and 2012, I really started getting into it more and really enjoyed it. So it was, having a nice snowstorm out there. And there's some trails near where I lived at the time. Not super rugged mountains, but, mountains. And so about 3 p.m, I decided to go out and cross-country ski. And, the storm was still going pretty full on. And my housemate was a Friday, I believe. He was about to go into Burlington. He was about to leave soon, which he usually did around like 4 p.m. So I headed out, and I would say within a few minutes, it was snowing really hard, and no trail had really been set. So it was a little bit tough going, but, I was having fun. But I kept on having this kind of recurring thought, or almost like a psychic or mental nudge, kept on having this phrase come to mind, like, watch out for your head, And I'm pretty careful. I'm definitely not a daredevil, but, I like to have fun and go down some hills. And so I'm going about, having fun out there, probably about a half hour. And, having a little bit of difficulty because it was snowing really hard. And the snow was pretty deep, fairly fluffy, pretty cold out, but there wasn't much track that had been set. So it was, a little bit of a challenge. And a couple of minor things, not having total control as I like, and having a couple of branches, whack my face. So I went over to another area where there's some definitely more challenging hills. And so I had been out there about a little over a half an hour at this point, and decided to try this one area coming down a hill with a curve to the left at the bottom. And one or two runs, I like going downhill, even though I'm not a downhill skier. So those didn't go that well. Nothing bad, but just, kind of lost my footing. And so I think it was the third time. I kind of like that. I like to do it successfully. So I coming down for the third time. And so what happened was, as I recall, right about at the bottom of the hill, or where it eases up, where the steepness, decreases as it turns to the left, there's a couple of trees, there along kind of the edge of the slope, and felt what I thought was, well, it was actually some smaller branches kind of scratch or brush the side of my face. And at that point, I had been out there for maybe close to 45 minutes, and it was just hard to see, really hard to get good footing, especially when you're coming down a hill and turning. It was so much loose, fluffy stuff. I just kind of figured, I'm going to pack it in for today. But within a few seconds, so, I came down, had these branches kind of scratch my face a bit. In my mind, I kind of said, the heck with it. I'm going to pack it in for today. And I remember about 3 or 4 or 5 more seconds after that, I remember continuing on. The slope, was definitely not as steep at this point. And just kind of hard to describe exactly. All of a sudden, just faded out. I remember approaching this little creek that was mostly frozen over, not totally. So it would have been about another 3 or 4 seconds. And all of a sudden, I don't know, this reality just faded out, faded away. And I was suddenly in a completely different world, a completely different realm that had no connection whatever to physical reality, consensual physical reality. There was no sense of, no awareness of my own body, no awareness of, put it like, anything in my world or anything in, what we call the world. There was no sensory input, so to speak. And I was totally aware of who I was. I knew I was me, and there was an incredible sense of peace. And I think one of the most powerful feelings was enveloping me was a sense of, this is my true home. This is where my soul, my spirit, my true self belongs. This is where it came from. And this is the real truth. This is what existence, beingness, is truly about. It wasn't so much even in relation to my regular life, because I have like no awareness of my regular life whatsoever. Not just, my immediate situation, which had been, out in the woods skiing, but there was definitely like a total awareness of my being and, it's not really personality, just like, your true core essence, like totally felt that completely. But as for where my consciousness was, it was definitely, like I said, in this, like what felt like the true home, like the true source place of existence, and like where I wanted to be, I guess. I don't even know I would say that, just where I felt 100% safe and loved, and like there was no sense of concern or anxiety or worry, like an incredibly pure, peaceful state, I guess I would say. And I had these, it's like sensation. I wouldn't really say so much actual sight or vision, kind of like an awareness of, seemed like balls of energy. And honestly, I'm not really sure how many. I would say it seemed like two or three. And that's another thing about time. Yeah, there was just no sense of time at all. Like an extraordinary feeling. No sense of time, no sense of, concern or I have to do this or I have to do that or anything. And I just kind of had this sensation of like blue space. Yeah, that's kind of how my perception was. And these kind of balls of energy, they were like beings. And it's a little hard to say for sure, but my feeling was that one of them was definitely my mom, who had died almost exactly 2 years earlier in April of 2016. And the other one, I'm a little unsure of. There may have even been a third one. The other one possibly was my father, who died about 30 some odd years, prior. And possibly also a very close friend of mine who fortunately took her life in 2011. But I'm pretty sure those were beings. Definitely sure about my mom. So honestly, I'll explain a little more later, but, from the perspective of no longer being in that reality, I would have to say that compared to many near-death experiences I've heard and read about, it was significantly different and significantly less involved. A lot of the things you hear about tunnel and so on, and, going towards a light, that was not part of it. So, what was part of it was just like an incredible sense of peace, of tremendous love, I guess, feeling, like I said, like totally protected in a way that's almost impossible to describe. It wasn't even protected from any kind of threat, because there was no threat. It was just a feeling of something, but cherished, enveloped in love and enveloped in profound compassion. So I'm trying to think of anything else in particular, like when I was in this state, that would stand out or express it a little more, or define it a little more. But I do feel that I was told in some way that I wasn't going to be there long and that I was in danger, that my physical form was kind of in trouble. And I feel that I was kind of given a message in some way, obviously balls of light or energy don't necessarily talk, but that was like a feeling that came to me that I wasn't going to be in this dimension long, and that I was in some physical peril, and that I should call my son immediately. There may be more that I just, can't quite remember. So the interesting thing here, okay, so like this was a sense of, guys, like I said, like this is the true reality. This is, what's actually fundamentally real, beyond and above and beyond anything the world we see around us. And it was an incredibly powerful feeling. And I had, read some things about near-death experiences. I was a little bit familiar with the subject, I guess, type of experiences, and definitely never had one before, anything remotely like it. So this is, I'm totally enveloped in this reality and like just absolute certainty that this is like the true reality. And then the next thing I know, I'm kind of like standing in the woods, snowing like crazy, and I have no idea where I am. And I'm thinking, what's going on? Because I was just in where, the place where I really belong, where we all ultimately come from, where we all belong, the ultimate true sort of reality of beingness. And you're like, what is this? I mean, I knew who I was still. I like never didn't know who I was, but I'm like, what the heck am I doing here? I was just in the ultimate reality, the place, that is like where we really live almost, or something, where our true self lives or something. So it was like very disorienting for a little while. And I literally didn't know where I was. But even aside from that, I didn't even know like what was going on. I felt like I was having a dream, like a dream about skiing. That was actually the feeling when I kind of came back to this consciousness or something, was being a dream. It is sometimes with a dream, you're like, when you're in the dream, sometimes it can seem very real. So that was one of those really vivid dreams, but that it sort of became more and more clear that I'm actually here. And I just had this immediate impulse to call my son. And this particular area, it's mountainous. So some areas you have a signal with cell phones, some areas you don't. Luckily, I guess, as it was, I pulled out my phone and there was a signal. So I immediately called him. He was in California. But I talked to him earlier that day, actually. We used to talk probably twice a week. So, we had a pretty long conversation earlier that day. And I just pulled out my phone. Once I got a little bit of sense, like, okay, I'm like really here, but like, I don't know where here is. So I pulled out my cell phone. So I had a signal, called him. And I guess because we had talked, at some length, probably a couple hours before, he sounded a little bit, I wouldn't say bothered, but just kind of like, hi, what's up? So I said, well, where am I? Am I in California? Just to say here, I was actually planning to move to California later in that year, like summer of 2018. And I had lived in California for many years, up till about 2010 or so. So that's one of the things that was, I just wasn't oriented to physical reality very well. When I lived in Northern California, I lived out in the mountains in the woods up in Mendocino County. So I just wasn't clear, like, where I was. I knew who he was. I knew who I was, very definitely. There wasn't like a total, mishmash in my brain. Maybe because I had planning to move to California within, several months. So it was probably somewhat in some part of my consciousness. And I literally wasn't sure, So I said, am I in California? He goes, no, you're in Vermont. Getting a little bit of a worried tone. Anyway, so I said, I don't know what's going on. I don't know where I am. I'm on skis. I'm in the woods. It's snowing. And, he kind of kept dialoguing with me. He had visited me in Vermont several times. So he kind of knew a little bit about the area. He had visited me at that location, in fact. As I'm talking to him, I said, maybe I hit my head because I had no actual memory of that. The only memory I had was of these branches scratching my face. But obviously the branches were attached to a tree. And right past the branches was like the trunk of a pretty sizable tree. But, just trying to figure out what was going on, So I said, maybe I hit my head, and then I pulled the phone away from my ear, blood on the phone from my right ear. So I said, yeah, I definitely hit my head. And at this point, I'm starting to kind of get a little bit of a sense of my location, because I had been in these woods, a fair amount of times. And started to kind of like compute, like, oh, okay, I know if I go down that slope. He said, well, I'm going to call your housemate. Visited me there the year before. He got along well. He liked my housemate. He actually had his number. So he did a three-way call. And luckily, my housemate, was probably just about to leave the house, as I had said earlier, was going to go into Burlington. But I guess he was still maybe, I don't even know exactly, not too far or something. So we're doing a three-way conversation, and he said, Will is my housemate. He said, do you know where you are? It's coming, I'm getting it now. So he goes, okay. Yeah, I told him. He goes, yeah. He goes, well, I'm going to park the road and I'm going to walk in. If you start walking out, if you're able to walk out, do your best and I'll meet you. And he did, we met partway. And by this point, there was no pain at all other than a little bit of a scraping when these branches hit my face. But as I was talking to my son, especially as I started to walk out, my whole head just felt like, like was on fire inside. It's like not a regular headache, just some kind of inflammation, burning sensation. And so when I met my housemate and, we walked back the rest of the way to his car and he drove me into Burlington to the emergency services and so on, which I can get to in a minute. But anyway, it's just, it was definitely like a major whack to the head. And they did a CAT scan. The guy who was on duty was nighttime at this point. He didn't really, I guess wasn't that familiar with interpreting CAT scans. And, they kept me there for a couple of hours to make sure go to sleep, because that can be a bad thing. And after a few hours, they said, well, my head was still hurting really badly, but they said, you can probably go home. It's all right. So my housemate took me home. And the next morning, the hospital called and said, well, the fellow on duty didn't interpret the results correctly, but you definitely have like a skull fracture, the right side where the impact was, and pretty close to the ear. It wasn't drastic, but for about 3 months afterwards, whenever I would chew, I would hear the bones, like rubbing together. But that finally went away. But anyway, so it was definitely a skull fracture, undoubtedly some kind of concussion and so on. But the next day and over the next few days, I went back to, the location where this happened because my housemate had been a ski instructor. And when I told him, described it to him, he goes, well, you probably lost your footing, went down, hit a rock, something hard, and went unconscious and, came to. I said, well, yeah, maybe. I wasn't unconscious, though. I wasn't just like in some black void, no awareness, the experience that I've described. So I went back there, the next day. I mean, it stopped snowing. There was plenty of snow on the ground, but I could see my tracks quite clearly coming down the hill. And I could see where it, got very close to this tree. And on the trunk of the tree, right about my head level, all the bark, which was pretty tough stuff, was broken away. That was my head that did that. But the interesting thing is, it was quite clear from the tracks in the snow that I had not gone down at all. And over a period of like weeks and even months, little bits came back to me. Like I started to remember, like after I had hit the branches, as I described it, maybe that distracted me and, it was cold. So sometimes you get a little bit numb. So I never felt the impact of the tree trunk. It was just, I felt the branches and kind of immediately said, this is going to be, not fun. And over the next few weeks and months, I started to remember like the next few seconds, as I described them, which that memory wasn't there at first, but over the next few weeks and months, it came back of like the next few seconds of continuing on, which I definitely did. Even though it was like obviously a pretty serious whack, I managed to keep my footing and continue on. And the really interesting thing is when I actually lost total awareness of my physical body and my physical surroundings, I kept skiing. What's very unusual about this kind of thing. Everybody I've told this to who knows anything about head trauma and concussion and so on, it's pretty rare. And I'm not really sure how that happened, but I have a feeling that this is my sense, that someone, my mom, God, some collection of entities looking out for me. And, maybe I had enough skill at that point. I'm not like super skilled, but enough skill to I definitely kept my footing. I could see that from the tracks. But it's interesting how, when I lost awareness, consciousness of, this physical reality, I stayed on my skis and kept going. And I know this for a fact because I approached this little creek that was mostly frozen. I had to, get across it. And that's basically when any awareness of this realm disappeared. I got across it and kept going up, up a slope on the other side of the creek through like a little area of woods up into a clearing area. And that's when I started to, kind of come back to this reality. So it's an unusual element of the whole story that I don't see how I could have done that almost. Because if you're not aware of your body at all, I mean, like totally not, how do you maintain physical process, physical, action and so on that requires like definitely skill and awareness of your surroundings. But I didn't have any awareness of my surroundings. So I don't really know how to explain that. But anyway, as I, started to come to and, made the call to my son and so on, and during our conversation there, I think, as I started to become more back to reality, so to speak, I remember looking at the time on my phone, and I clarified this with my son later. It was about maybe 3:45, 3:50 when I called. So tried to piece together the timeline of how long, since I left the house to go skiing, how long I had, not been in my body, basically. And it wasn't very long. But I would say the sense of, when I was fully immersed in that experience was absolutely like a sense of like eternity. No awareness or sense of time whatsoever. It was like the perfect realm, but it was brief, obviously. I mean, if I figure how long it would have taken me from when I kind of went out until I had somehow gotten across the creek and up this other hill, come back everyday awareness, a minute or something, not very long. I feel like I sort of had like an NDE light. How else to put it? Because, many things that I've heard about, read about, and other research and accounts significantly more elaborate, life review and so on, this kind of thing. There was definitely not, I didn't experience any of that. And it's almost like I feel like I said, somehow I was being protected or guided in a way from another realm, another dimension, that it was almost like something that was important, very powerful and important to experience. It certainly could have ended up differently. I think everybody was pretty surprised that I managed to stay on my feet after, smacking into a tree trunk at, pretty high speed. I don't really know. That's a mysterious element. And certainly my ex-housemate, who was a ski instructor and had definitely seen people get concussed and so on, he'd never heard of that, really. So that's strange. I think that's a very interesting element of the whole thing, that somehow some force, I feel, kept me upright and kept me kind of going forward, literally. And somehow, I mean, it wasn't super challenging at that point, but it's some, navigating the snow and the slope and the obstacles and the trees, never falling without any, without any awareness of what was happening at all. Just something about it. I don't know. We were pretty close. She was a great gal. I was with her when she died, which was pretty incredible. She wasn't conscious, so-called, but I was there. And I just feel certain that the strongest connection with, it seemed like three entities that were much more present or prominent. And I kind of had a sense that there were others kind of not quite as connected to me or not quite as, close in a weird way. It was a visual perception in some way, but it was like, what does consciousness look like? I don't know, but it was like they were consciousnesses, and it seemed like they were kind of off to my left a bit. Yeah, I would say, feel certain about my mom. I'm pretty sure about, one of them being my dad and the third one being an ex-partner and dear friend, Susan, who I was, with in California, lived with in California for some years. And then we were very close friends. She was my son's godfather, all kinds of stuff. So we had a pretty powerful connection in life. So yeah, and I just felt like they were definitely I felt love, like definite powerful love and caring from these energies, and a sense of protection isn't really the right word, but maybe something like that. Like I had no awareness of my physical existence at all. I knew I was me, but it was sort of like, oh, this is the real me. And this is, my real place. This is my real home. That was like absolute certainty of a sensation for sure. So I wasn't thinking of anything about skiing. That was like just like nothing happening with that. Or even weird way, just thinking about this, maybe I'm not even sure how much awareness I had of my son, but it seems like maybe my mom, I mean, I would say most likely I got a message, something about him. He is very important to me. We have a great relationship. He's a great guy, wonderful person, but something like cluing me back almost. Now, this makes me think of things you hear a lot about in near-death experiences, like why do they want to, they don't want to go back, but they have a connection in this world that's extremely important. And it's almost like that's what I was being told, part of, I don't think it was an accident that, I mean, it could have been terminal, if I'd gone face down in the snow and suffocated, which happens than that. But I feel like I was definitely told, or kind of reminded almost, that there was something about my connection to my son that was big reason. That's quite the right word, or, I guess sort of a reason why I'm here or something in this life, something like that. It's a little hard to put into words because I don't think words were exactly how this was coming across, but something about the importance of that connection and the importance to him that I get through this experience. And, like I wasn't going to stay there. It was pretty awesome, though. Pretty great space. But anyway, yeah, that's about all I can really come up with regarding those entities and that part of it. I guess that was the main element of, the experience. So other than just the incredible sensations, love and caring and peace and all the stuff that's going on in this world and in our own lives, there's so much of it. It's just part of how it is, so much of it is challenging in different ways and always things to deal with that are stressful or painful or hurtful. That's not all the experiences, of course, but I mean, it's just an element of existence here. And it was like absolutely all that was completely non-existent. It's like this pure, unbelievably pure, peaceful, not boring. It's sort of like whatever, I just had this brief immersion in. I can definitely see how that's the realm of infinite, unlimited experience of all kind. Like if I had been there longer or something, the interactions and so on between these other entities, just for example, there was so much that could be there, I would say. That's a feeling I have. But, as it wasn't very long. I mean, when I was in it, it was timeless, but obviously it wasn't very long, in our timeline, and there wasn't a tremendous exposition or development of events or experiences in that realm. Before I headed out to go ski that afternoon, I smoked a little pot, which is, not uncommon for me. I'm not like a huge pot smoker these days, but I smoked a few puffs or something. So he said, like, are you sure this wasn't, some kind of pot experience? And it's like, well, I don't think so. I mean, I definitely hit the tree and I've never had, any kind of experience like that from smoking pot before. So, I mean, he was somewhat joking, but, it's just kind of like checking in on that. To be honest with you, I mean, I think just, in our culture, there's often a kind of a little bit of a skepticism to, accounts like this. Yeah, I don't know. I can't think of anything really, other than that, him saying that, which was somewhat humorous. But, I talked to him a lot about it, actually. Many other people, probably half a dozen or so. And yeah, I mean, like I said, when I get through and, maybe to answer a couple of questions, most people seem to say, oh, well, they're not questioning my sanity or anything. They pretty much have been accepting of, this is what I experienced. I would say over time, like immediately, like I was out the next day skiing. I was literally out there skiing when I got the call from the hospital the next day saying I had like a skull fracture. I'm like, oh, okay. I mean, I would say the initial after effects were amazement and, just like, yeah, really like a deep level of amazement and wonder. Like, what in the heck was going on? Because, people say, well, you had a concussion. Well, what does that mean? I don't know anything, all I knew was like, I was still me and I was in a completely different reality, 100% zero connection, at least, this reality. But over the months and years to follow, I would say it's definitely had a very, very powerful effect on me, which I'm still kind of processing. I think fear of pain and injury, especially extreme pain and injury and death, is pretty powerful aspect of being a physical creature. I don't feel like I do really well with pain. Like I'm not much of a person in that way. Actually, when it's happened, I guess I'm better than think about myself. But, you hear often in a lot of accounts that major physical trauma and they're almost immediately like out of their body. And I guess to some extent that it happened with me because smacking into a tree with the side of your head at, whatever speed, got to be pretty painful. I wasn't really aware of it until after I had kind of come back to this reality and talking to my son a little bit, and then, it started to come on like, whoa, like literally my whole head was just like burning from the inside. So I guess, it was pretty serious, but I guess there was a concussion also, but whatever that is, I don't actually know what the medical technical definition is, but there was no unconsciousness on my part ever of any kind. It was like conscious the whole time, which is in a different place. Yeah, the impact, how it changed my life. Well, it was a very good proof. I don't know how else to put it. There's absolutely something more to our existence as a being than than the human body. And in fact, the sense was powerful, I would say indisputable to me. That is the prior and final, ultimate or something state of our being. That's where we come from, and that's where we go. I mean, that was extremely clear to me. So that's pretty awesome to to realize. I mean, I still feel like it may not be the easiest thing, dying, tending. Some people seem to slide out pretty easily, others not. I hope to avoid like getting crushed under a steamroller or something. That would probably be good to avoid, but it's definitely given me this, I guess I would have to say, a certainty that physical existence is just almost like a dream, because that's the sensation I had when I first came out of that. Definitely thought like I'm having some kind of dream, man, because I was just in the real reality. So this is some kind of dream. And I think that's not exactly right. I think, our life here is extremely important. It's all about learning. I would say how to bring those kinds of ultimate or transcendent truths and aspects of that other reality that I was in to this reality. And I hope the human race can do it. Seems a little questionable sometimes, but I also feel like that's an experience that come into what's really important about this reality to me is like the people that you really connect with. That's what's transcends this reality, because that's a major element of being in that other realm. Beings that we're connected to, that we share love with and understanding and whatever other experiences. So yeah, I guess it's definitely changed my life a lot, but I'm still working on it. But I feel much more, oriented towards being kind and understanding and compassionate and helpful and supportive to others. Try not to be, make judgments and see people as different, which is so common in all kinds of ways. You're this, you're that, you're Republican, you're Democrat, foreign, you're immigrant, you're fat, whatever the hell it is, judgments and stuff. And I still struggle with that. I think a lot of that stuff comes in. We're born from so many different angles, society, conditioning, and cultural norms and so on. They get really imprinted pretty heavily, and all kinds of things about, what you need to do for yourself, how important yourself is in that way, kind of like as a me against them, and all these kinds of things that are really a major element of, unfortunately, of current society. Much of it, in my opinion, brought about by capitalism, and everything that means, everything that like inherent and fundamental in that is you against everybody else. Profits above all, and you got to look out for yourself above all. It's really destroying the planet and people's well-being. So that's my more personal view on it. So that's really how it's changed my life a lot. And as I said, I'm still working on it to bring that way of going about my life every day as a Catholic. And there's all kinds of stuff in there about, the immortal soul and so on, which I would say I pretty much I felt that's in some way true. I would say most of my life, even when I was a kid. I remember having a dream once when I was very, very young about, that's what brought this on, but dream, I guess it was a dream of like, my soul, like leaving my body. I was probably about 5 or 6 or something. And soul actually had like a shape in this dream, and I could see it like, and I was like, oh, cool. So that's what a soul looks like, because I'd heard about it. My parents were Catholic and all, so I was like, oh, so yeah, there's a soul, and that's what it looks like. Which it looked sort of like, I don't even know, like a comma, like a sort of sphere with like a little tail or something. God knows. But I would say when I was in my late teens and 20s, I was definitely interested in, never really stayed with the Catholic thing, but I was interested in Tibetan or Buddhism in general, Hinduism to some extent, and, mystical Christianity in some ways, just, like the deeper truths and philosophy and spirituality that have been kind of prominent threads over millennia. Plato, all those guys were being pretty certain that there's a non-physical element to beingness. And I guess my ideas up until this event were somewhat hazy, and it's like, well, how do you know? The interesting thing about near-death experiences, I would still have to say, is like, as we talked about earlier, the developments in resuscitation technology and so on have made this, much more common. And that's interesting. At the same time, we still don't really know what it's like for the people who don't come back. I was also interested in Native American First Nations, American Indian so-called cultures, and their views on spirituality and this kind of thing, which are a little different than kind of more well-known, say, Buddhist or Christian or Hindu ideas. I think their ideas a little bit more like they see a parallel between processes in the physical world and processes in the spiritual world. And so what we see in the physical world is that, let's just say, tree falls or body dies, and it's still there as an object, but as over time, its elements start to break down and become part of everything else. And I think that's somewhat how at least certain Native American traditions see it. I have read some things to that effect, which is a little bit similar, I guess, to kind of like some of the Hindu stuff, where you merge back into the ocean. And I remember I even talked about this stuff like this with my mom at times, and she was pretty not really on board with that idea. And I can kind of felt that too. It's like, well, why would, God or whatever, or the universe, however, evolution, conscious evolution, why would it get to this place of evolving to the point where, we have individuated consciousnesses and experiences just for it all to kind of like merge back in? So I don't really know, obviously, because I came back, but I don't even know how far out there I was. So, it's hard to say. So that's a little bit of a different view. As I was saying, do we actually, so, like, does that sense of, you still know who you are, is that permanent, eternal also? So I don't know. In a way, I feel like it's probably a bit of both. I think probably there's always a sense of an individual in some way experience, but I think we'd feel the connection to everything much more fully and powerfully than we often do in our physical bodies. One thing I was going to mention, I was listening to an NDE not long ago, and you might have heard this one. I think it's been on a few different channels. It's a guy, I think he was doing some rock climbing in the Canadian Rockies, I believe outside of Alberta somewhere. And I think they made some pretty major mistakes of setting out too late in the day, and it was way high up there. As it got dark, their timing was all off. And anyway, they basically, I mean, at least the guy who was describing this, kind of like pretty much froze to death. But one thing he was describing, kind of going in and out, like on, heading out, he was going back and forth a bit, was like, and I've heard this similar descriptions, like, which I didn't have, unless I just can't really remember. Visions or experience of like incredible splendor, and almost like people talk about colors that are unbelievably more vibrant than, what we see, and stars that are incredibly more vibrant, or music. It's interesting to me. That's just extraordinarily beautiful and powerful compared to what is in our realm. And what's interesting to me is that I almost think there's not necessarily that much of a barrier between this realm and the superconscious or non-physical realm, and that it's more limitations that are perceptions and senses and concepts and preconditions and everything put on our experience. And so I think if you apply that to the whole picture, maybe that's one of the reasons that death is often rough, is because we're not seeing how this is not so separate in a way, like from the other realm. We're holding on to all these kinds of elements of our experience here. I think we get very attached to not just money, but whatever the features are of physical existence that, we like. The fear of like losing that, losing some sense of power or something. But I feel like that creates a lot of this trauma around death. Well, it's probably pretty traumatic, but this is like an insight I've had that I think is probably somewhat valid. The attachment and the holding on, and the fear of like losing what we're so used to or something, is a factor of the trauma around death, and that this realm is not necessarily so different than the non-physical realm. When I was younger, I had some interesting experiences with various psychedelics and so on. And you can definitely perceive this world, this reality, in a different way if your consciousness is in a different place. I wouldn't say that I experienced anything like I did when I had this accident, but I would say that I probably was more open to it, maybe in some ways, or, not resisting, or open to some of like things I had read and experienced when I was younger, which probably made me more open to these experiences, that kind of experience that I had, and, spiritual or philosophical accounts and so forth that delve into that. I would say on the last point, I think in my life I've experienced that often people who are very, let's say, for lack of a better word, spiritually oriented or so on, tend to be, and I had this criticism in my life, made this criticism, I guess, to my mind, a little bit too sort of disconnected or disinterested, or just, not seeing the importance of the socio-political aspects of reality here in the world. And, as I said, I've been critical of that, and I feel that it's very important to make that connection, to bring these kinds of truths and importance of what those experiences, such as I had and other near-death experiencers have had, into our world every day, and into our political systems and our cultural practices and so on. Because I really feel like that's not happening in a way like when I was quite a bit younger. I sort of thought it would happen. It's sort of like, I guess there's a way of putting it as a phrase, spiritual materialism. And I feel like people can get too sort of wrapped up in a spirituality that's kind of insular and cut off from the everyday world. And I understand that, like the experience I had, and some that are much more vivid or profound, maybe obviously show us that physical world, it's a construct in some way. It's an immersive experience, but it's not like the ultimate, like the true reality. But we're here for a reason, obviously. We're going through it for a reason. And I think I'm all for doing what I can, and all of us doing what we can to make it a better experience and a more fair, world. And so there's not billions of people literally whose everyday lives are terrible, so that a billion or so people in, developed countries can have a much easier life. I mean, I'm all for everybody having an easier life, but, there's like some really fundamental inequalities and unfairness in the way the world is set up right now that are horrible. I guess that's where I would leave that. The importance of bringing these deep spiritual truths and everything that they mean into this world, and it's like, we can do it. This is physical. Yes, we all will die in our physical bodies, but nonetheless, we could make this much more like that realm. I guess that's where I would leave it. We can do it. We could do it. So I hope it happens.